Okay, so recently, Moody's Analytics came out with a report saying that the top 10% of income earning households in the US now account for 50% of all consumer spending. And I know that that came as a shock to a lot of people, but unfortunately, it did not for me. There are various different surveys that you could have looked at that were more or less suggesting that was the case. And, this idea of bifurcation in the economy is now more true than it really has ever been. So I think it's important to put some numbers behind that and why that this is, in my opinion, important to like the broader sort of economy and where we go from here. Because to me, the math doesn't make sense. So if you want to think about the top 10% of all households, well, there are like what, roughly 130 million households in the United States. So that's 13 million households. So the 13 million households are supposed to carry the remaining 90% of households. Is that how that works? And are we sure we won't have maybe like a deflationary little blip? You know, or there's this idea that you often hear from people saying, well, incomes are going to catch up to the cost of living and they're going to compare now to maybe say like the 1970s when something like that happened, when the households look nothing like they they did at that time. And so I want to spend some time talking about really households, because that's sort of how I see the economy is through that lens and through housing, because in my opinion that is the economic cycle. So that being said, if you want to think about like incomes across these various households, there's a particular cut of the household data, and like the top income earning bucket of households is 200 plus thousand bucks on an inflation adjusted basis. Really from the 90s to the early 2000s, they accounted for around 8% of all households. Now, really post GFC got, way worse. They now account for, I want to say 14.5% of all households. So it really is bifurcation at its finest. There's no middle class anymore. But now I think it's worth taking it a step further and like seeing all the sort of downstream implications for something like the housing industry and why there's maybe stress in something like multifamily. So there's around 45 million renter households in the United States. The remainder are obviously homeowners, and around 40% of homeowners now no longer have mortgages. And obviously, if they don't have mortgages, they're going to have less housing cost in general. But let's focus on the renters for a second. Because they're subject to market rates, that just means more of them are just cost burden in general. Around 50% of all renter households pay 30% plus of their income towards rent. That's what somebody means when they say cost burden. If you want to take it a step further, around 25% of renter households pay 50% plus of their income towards rent. And you can just imagine, if you were thinking about the increase in renter households post-COVID, how that distribution looked like. Of course, the majority was on the cost burden side. But if you were to look at homeowners, that's where the bifurcation becomes very, very clear. So on the one hand, you had an increase in homes without mortgages, because obviously people don't buy the same home at the same price, under the same financing terms at the same time, of course. While that was happening, you had a growing share of people who financed their purchase that were very cost burdened. So you started to see a growth in these mortgaged households that were paying 50% plus of their income towards shelter costs. That's a problem. And we even if you were to line that up with really the origination data, it makes perfect sense. And by the way, just because I'm talking about this at a national level doesn't mean that you can't observe it at a local level, because you can, okay? I look at it all over the place. Other people do too. That's not a bold statement. The data exists. It's just a matter of going out and looking at it. So there's a very good reason somebody like Mr. Pulte was, grilled the other day about, hey, like, have we possibly, lent to people who may not be able to actually afford the home? And of course that's the case. So all these people like saying, oh, well, now we have dual income households. Those are just a bunch of bad actors who are full of shit. Okay? Again, that is something that you can observe all over the place. Dual income households have been around for decades, okay? Women join the workforce in absolutely enormous numbers, really, being in the late 60s and on. And this idea that, hey, maybe one market over here, there is sort of immune to a trend like that is a bunch of bullshit. So, think about that within the broader context of where we go from here in the economy. Is it possible that we have maybe like a little deflationary bout if the majority of households, especially on the renter side, are already extremely cost burdened? We have a softening labor market. Where is the incremental household income going to come from, given those circumstances? Are we really sure that we're in this sort of stagflationary backdrop? That could be the longer term, and maybe it's even a near-term trend too. But in my opinion, it's not going to be for the same reasons as last time. So people are just smoking crack when they talk, oh yeah, home prices are going to go straight up, from here because of some housing shortage, which they can't even really define or quantify. That's pretty funny. That's where we are. So, I don't know, guys. It is what it is. But I think it's really stupid. Anyway, that's all I got.